Nipmuc were out for blood, and the people of Sudbury knew that an attack could come at any time. So the town came together to see to its own defence. There was no military fort within town limits. If and when Indigenous forces attacked, the townspeople were to flee to one of a number of buttressed private homes referred to as garrison houses, the walls of which were often lined with brick to protect against gunfire. The people of Sudbury spent the rest of 1675 fortifying their garrison houses as well as other homes and barns, as though preparing for the landfall of a fearsome hurricane. Edmund Brown, now in his early 70s and still town minister, turned his homestead at Timberneck into a garrison house. Though he made impressive progress on the work for a man of advancing years, in September he wrote to the governor of Massachusetts Bay asking for additional hands. It may be a reflection of his poor standing in the community, or simply his well-recorded personal pride, that he asked the government rather than his neighbours for help. On the west side of the river, the Goodenow and Haynes families also shored up their homes into formidable fortresses. That summer and autumn, the war raged hottest in the Connecticut River Valley, west of Nipmuc country, where English forces were faced with defeat at every turn. This disconcerting news must have made the work of fortification even more frantic and urgent. Anxiety in Sudbury must have run high, as political issues that once seemed so distant and unimportant now threatened to burst through their front doors, hooting and hollering, an axe in one hand and a ball club in the other. Autumn turned to winter, and anxiety turned to outright panic when hostile Native Americans began to be spotted in the woods around the town, especially at night. In another letter to the Massachusetts government, Reverend Brown reported that
our woods are pestered with Indians. One Adams within our bounds was shot at by a Larkin Indian or Mar. He was shot through the coat and shirt near to the armpit. One Smith Walk in the woods was assailed by 3 or 4 Indians, whom he discovered swooping down a hill toward him, but Smith saved himself by his legs. One Joseph Freeman, coming up about 4 Mile Brook, discovered 2 Indians, one in the path, presenting his gun at him in the way in a bright moonlight night. But Freeman, dismounting, shot at him, and mounting, rode for it. One Joseph Chalet, coming home from Marlborough on Thursday last, discovered Indians in our bounds, one of which made a shot at him, the bullet passing by him, but being mounted and riding for it, he escaped. One Joseph Curtis, son to Ephraim Curtis, on Saturday last, heard 3 volleys of shot made by Indians between us and Weston. The consideration of all which I hope will excite you, to order that these woods may be scoured, and that our town of Sudbury, a frontier town, may be enabled to contribute aid therein, and defend itself with its quantity of men I humbly move.
As frightening as these encounters were, in 1675 they remained isolated incidents. But in January 1676, the English received intelligence from praying Indian spies that the Nipmuc were planning a major offensive into Middlesex County to retake their eastern homelands by fire and sword. Hundreds of Indigenous warriors and their families began moving into the area in preparation for the assault. Among them were former residents of the Muskedequid Valley, who, befitting Algonquian wartime custom, had come to wreak personal revenge against individual English men and women who they felt had wronged them. This was almost certainly the case with Nettus, the praying Indian who had been sued by a Sudbury settler for reneging on a debt. Sometime in the 20 years since, he had apostatized from Christianity, and with the outbreak of King Philip's War, took up arms against the English, entering Mutterwump's service as a war leader. On February the 1st or 2nd, Nettus led about a dozen native warriors to the isolated farmhouse of Thomas Eames on the outskirts of Sudbury. The Eames family had been Nettus's neighbours for decades. It's unknown why he targeted Eames specifically, but it's highly likely that the war leader felt the farmer had slighted him in some way. Perhaps the 2 men had always hated each other. Whatever the case may be, When Nettus's warband swooped in for the attack, they found Eames himself was not at home, so they contented themselves with terrorising his family. According to one possibly apocryphal account, Eames's wife was rendering tallow for soap at the time of the raid and managed to disfigure a few indigenous warriors by throwing boiling fat on them before they were finally able to cut her down. After which, Nettus either murdered or took captive her 9 children. The warriors set fire to Eames's house and barn, slaughtered his cows, and melted back into the forest before anyone else in Sudbury knew what was happening. On February the 9th, the Indigenous offensive began in earnest with a brutal attack on Lancaster, Massachusetts, 15 miles northwest of Sudbury, a raid so destructive that it led to the temporary abandonment of the town. Somewhat belatedly, the government of Massachusetts Bay began to take drastic action to reinforce the frontier. Marlborough was established as a base of military operations, receiving copious shipments of food, supplies, guns and ammunition. Captain Samuel Mosley was ordered to bring his notorious company of cutthroats and pirates to reinforce Sudbury. As colonial troops were typically quartered in the outbuildings of private homes, this must have been an extremely unpleasant time for several local families, as they were forced to house the most infamously bloodthirsty soldiers of the entire war. On February the 21st, Nipmuc forces attacked and burned nearby Medfield, 15 miles to the south. As the local militia tried to chase the marauders out of town, they found a note, written in English, affixed to the ruins of a destroyed bridge.
Know by this paper, that the Indians that thou hast provoked to wrath and anger will war this 21 years, if ye will. There are many Indians yet. We come 300 at this time. You must consider the Indians lost nothing but their life. You must lose your fair houses and cattle.
On March the 13th, the Nipmuc rampaged freely through Grattan to the north, burning the meeting house and most of the town as the populace cowered in their garrison houses. 2 days later, a pair of Englishmen travelling from Marlborough to Sudbury were ambushed by a group of native women who beat their brains out with clubs and castrated their corpses with shards of old metal. On March the 26th, native forces launched a major raid on Marlborough itself. It was a Sunday morning when militiamen and civilians alike were attending services in the meeting house. Tradition has it that the English only realised the town was on fire when the minister, suffering from an acute toothache, took a moment to step outside. Once the damage had been done and the Nipmuc had retreated, the militia promptly evacuated all the civilians of Marlborough, and the town was maintained purely as a military outpost under the command of Captain Samuel Brocklebank. Later that same day, terrifying reports flooded into Sudbury that the same force of Nipmuc warriors, some 300 strong, was now closing in on their western outskirts. Ephraim Curtis, never one to flee from danger, hastily organised a counterattack. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 27th, Curtis and 20 civilian volunteers, together with a group of Marlborough militiamen of about the same number, discovered a large camp of sleeping native warriors just outside town. They gingerly surrounded the camp and, probably at a preordained signal, let loose several volleys of musket fire. Taken completely by surprise, and likely having no idea how few Englishmen actually stood against them, the indigenous forces scattered into the woods. Walking among the dead and wounded, Curtis's men discovered the body of Nettus, who had been killed outright by a hail of lead. But this decisive victory did not prevent an all-out attack. It merely postponed it. Over the next 3 weeks, the thickest action of the war moved south as the Narragansett tore their way through their ancestral homelands in Rhode Island, avenging themselves for the unprovoked English massacre of several hundred of their people in the Great Swamp Fight the previous December. But the Nipmuc did not forget their humiliation at the hands of Curtis and the people of Sudbury. By April the 19th, an immense force of about 500 warriors had gathered on the sacred peak of Mount Wachusett. Though primarily Nipmuc, all the major nations of the Native Alliance were probably represented. According to Englishwoman Mary Rowlandson, who had been taken captive during the raid on Lancaster, they held a powwow where a sachem or war leader delivered 2 electrifying speeches to the warriors, holding a musket in each hand. In response, the warriors sang, shouted and hummed, banging the ground with sticks and fists. Then they streamed out of the camp, armed to the teeth, bound for Sudbury. April the 21st, 1676, probably began much like any other spring day in Sudbury. It was a clear and, according to one account, windy day. As the sun rose, the town began to stir, and households filled with the growing murmur of early morning chores. If a dog barked and snarled at the tree line in the misty gloom of dawn, no one took notice. Suddenly, musket fire rang out. Then, the ghostly echo of distant war cries. The people of Sudbury knew exactly what those sounds meant, and terror doubtlessly swept over them like a cold sweat. But they had prepared for 10 months for this moment and knew exactly what to do. The townspeople dropped everything, abandoned their homes, and made for whichever garrison house was closest. In those first few minutes, it's likely that very few villagers actually saw Indigenous raiders, but everyone could hear them. The war cries must have been loudest on the west side of the river. There were hundreds of voices in that warlike chorus, but to the fleeing townspeople it must have seemed like thousands. It's little wonder that later English accounts exaggerated the count of native combatants at this battle to 2 or 3 times their likeliest number. On the west bank, residents scurried into either the Haynes or Goodnow garrison houses. Smoke from burning houses and barns was probably starting to darken the horizon. Perhaps under the war cries, the refugees could also hear the agonised screams of their own cows and pigs as they were hacked to pieces in their pens, farm animals being a hated symbol of the English hunger for land, targeted again and again by native forces throughout King Philip's War. Almost immediately, the Haynes garrison house began to take heavy fire from Indigenous musketeers positioned on a hill to the rear of the house, at level with the fortified second storey, allowing the warriors to shoot directly into the windows from behind the cover of trees and rocks. But the Haynes garrison proved a hard nut to crack. Well supplied with shot and powder, the men of the garrison coolly picked off a number of their assailants, while suffering no recorded casualties themselves. As several eminent citizens of Sudbury later recounted,
the enemy with great force and fury assaulted Deacon Ains's house, well fortified yet badly situated, as advantageous to the enemy's approach as dangerous to the repellent. Yet by the help of God, the garrison not only defended the place from between 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning till about 1 in the afternoon, but forced the enemy, with considerable slaughter, to draw off.
Despite the fact that Sudbury had sounded its alarm, probably an ear-splitting cannon shot in the general direction of a nearby English settlement, the militia was naught to be found all morning. For now, the only relief on hand was a paltry 12-man detachment of civilian volunteers from Concord. The defenders of the Haynes garrison could probably see them approach down the northern road just across the river. But as they peered east, the defenders would have been presented by a very strange sight. A group of native women appeared on the road ahead of the Concord men, dancing and shouting. When the Concord men pursued, the women ran away, and a stomach-churning number of armed warriors emerged from the tall grasses to envelop and butcher the would-be rescuers. The skirmish was over before it could begin. After killing most of the Concord men, the warriors unceremoniously dumped their corpses in the boggy waters of the River Meadow. Fortunately for Sudbury, more help was coming. As their native besiegers finally retreated in the early afternoon, those at the Haynes garrison would have heard the crackle of musketry erupt both to the east and west, as militia companies from Watertown and Marlborough converged on the town. A few minutes later, there would have been a chorus of blood-curdling war cries to the west, 100 throats opening all at once, and then the shouts, screams and clamour of hand-to-hand combat. Though the townspeople at the Haynes garrison did not yet know it, the company of Captain Samuel Wadsworth, accompanied by the Marlborough militia of Samuel Brocklebank, had just been encircled by a deadly Nipmuc ambuscade. Captain Wadsworth's men fought their way up this hill in the hope that some high ground would bring safety. Here, at its summit, they made their stand. Facing native charges from all sides, Wadsworth ordered his men to form a square. They were outnumbered by possibly as much as 5 to 1, but nonetheless survived against impossible odds for 4 desperate hours. Wadsworth's men were physically exhausted, but the native forces arrayed against them were starving. Mary Rowlandson's account tells us that despite their military successes, the situation on the Indigenous home front was bleak in the spring of 1676. The beleaguered armies threw themselves at one another again and again. Finally, as nightfall approached, native warriors set the dry leaves and grasses of the hill on fire. Wind fanned the flames, choking Wadsworth's company with smoke, and at last they broke and ran, stumbling down this slope and into this gully, where native warriors quickly dispatched more than half of them, war clubs and hatchets rising and falling, cutting screams short. With that, Indigenous forces pulled back to the west, leaving a smouldering and grief-stricken town in its wake. The villagers remained in their garrison houses that night and most of the next morning, until a company of praying Indians, under the command of Captain Samuel Hunting, disguised themselves by removing their European clothing and putting on war paint, and reconnoitred the woods on the west side of the river, confirming that the native raiders had indeed departed. This company, together with some survivors from the English militia, then went to the base of Green Hill to bury Captain Wadsworth and his men. The Indigenous army, meanwhile, stopped in Marlborough that morning, where they burned deserted buildings, drove away cows, and taunted the few militiamen still stationed there, who watched the destruction from behind their palisades. The warriors headed back to their base at Mount Wachusett the following day. Despite their gloating in Marlborough, the Indigenous homecoming was sombre and sullen. As eyewitness Mary Rowlandson explained,
"They came home without that rejoicing and triumphing over their victory which they were wont to show at other times, but rather like dogs, as they say, which have lost their ears. When they went, they acted as if the devil had told them that they should gain the victory, and now they acted as if the devil had told them they should have a fall. Whether it were so or no, I cannot tell, but so it proved, for quickly they began to fall, and so held on that summer, till they came to utter ruin."